Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Audrie Chad, Director of Research at GRI, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's discussion on how climate change is driving down incomes. Although this is a virtual event and includes participants from across Canada and beyond, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the Global Risk Institute is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, is covered by Treaty 13 with Mississaugas of the Credit, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Through this land acknowledgement, we want to bring context to the history of our country and the importance of working toward reconciliation in all the ways we can. As global temperatures continue to break records, the immediate impacts of climate change are unmistakable. Rising temperatures are not only driving an increase in the frequency and severity of natural disasters, they are also undermining economic activity in much more subtle ways. We are very fortunate to have with us today the author of the recent GRI report, Already Heating Up: Climate Change and the Recent Economy, who I will introduce in a moment. Instead of talking about hurricanes, wildfires, and multi-billion-dollar losses, this report focuses on some of the more subtle effects of climate change, like an increase in the number of warm days, and how even these seemingly minor changes impact the larger economy. Before we begin, I would like to review a few housekeeping rules. Please note that the session is being recorded and that the recording will be shared on the GRI website in a few days. Your microphones have been muted to avoid background noise. We've allocated ample time for questions during the Q&A period at the end of the event. Please submit your questions through the chat and we will address as many as time allows. And finally, when you exit this webinar, you'll see a prompt for our event survey. Please take a few moments to fill it out. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us continue to improve our programming. And now let's get on with the program. Today with us, we have Professor Derek Lemoine from the University of Arizona. In addition to his role at the university, Derek is a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research and an associate fellow for the Center of Economic Policy Research in the Climate Change Research and Policy Network. His research investigates the dynamic and optimal environmental policy and energy systems, the economic consequences of climate change, how uncertainties affect the value of avoiding climate change, how to design policies to control climate change, and the value of short and long run weather forecasts, among other topics. His insights will provide valuable tools for improving climate risk management across sectors. Derek will share some remarks, and then I will moderate a Q&A. Derek, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Audrey. And thank you to GRI in general for funding this work. The work would not have happened without GRI's support, and especially Lorianne Weston provided a lot of guidance, and Sally Shin before Lorianne also provided a lot of feedback. So I'm really grateful both for the financial support and for the more conceptual support GRI has provided over time. I'm also very much looking forward to any feedback because this is a framework that can be applied in different ways and can evolve. And so this is sort of the first shot at getting some commentary on that. So the question here is, or the observation is something I think economists maybe were a little bit late to wake up to, that climate change is already here. It's not something for our grandkids only anymore. It's something that we're living with nowadays and it's already around. So that raises the question of what is it already doing to the economy? The traditional question in economics is what are the future losses from climate change? And the reason why we typically care about that is that we're really interested in how should you price emissions? What should the carbon tax be, or the social cost of carbon, or the level of a cap and a cap and trade? And that's all about the stream of losses over time, the present value of that stream of losses over time. Current losses are probably trivial compared to whatever future losses are going to be. So why should we care about that? One is just simply there's a public good. Just the knowing what climate change is already doing to the economy enables more efficient capital allocation, adaptation to climate change, risk management, public awareness. So there's just a lot of things that follow just from having a, why do we need a snapshot of what inflation is quarter by quarter? There's a lot of things that follow from that information that I think could be true of climate change as well. Two is that the only way of regulating carbon is not just through cap and trade or emission taxes. So I've done work in deposit refund schemes, and those schemes require that you can measure the ongoing damages of climate change in order to figure out what the refunds would be in those schemes. So if we're producing a number like the number I'm trying to come up with on a regular basis, it opens up very different ways of controlling carbon emissions. And finally, to the extent we do care about the cost of future climate change, whatever climate change is doing today is probably a lower bound on whatever the cost is going to be in the future. And it's something that I'm going to argue next we can probably measure a little more confidently. So why do I think this is something that we should be able to measure more confidently? So I'm currently writing an article for the major economic review journal on basically what we know about climate losses and how we know them. And one of the points in that article is that we're probably never going to know exactly what the total cost from climate change is going to be. It's just an intractable problem for a few different reasons. But there are reasons to think we can make a little more progress on current losses from climate change. So one is that one of the difficulties is that even if you could accurately assess what the effects of climate might be in the current environment, when you start projecting into the future, technologies and markets and institutions start looking different from what they are today. Whereas today, we're kind of early in the climate change process, technologies and markets are kind of similar to what they would have been without climate change. So you're not making a big leap of extrapolation. The other is that we don't have to worry as much about nonlinear effects. So when you start looking into the future, you start looking both about nonlinearities in the global system, nonlinearities in local adaptation and local impacts. A lot of that stuff goes out the water with current impacts because climate change is here and it's real and it's measurable, but it's all at the same time it's not that large where you really have to start worrying about tipping point type phenomena. So I think the tools we have to address are a little more applicable for current losses because climate change hasn't been that great yet. So they have a conceptual framework in the report, and this is novel. I mean, I wouldn't say it's super deep theory, but it's a way to sort of connect to data. I'll summarize briefly what comes out of that. And so what pops out is that if you want to get the impact of climate change in the economy, you need to think about a few different channels. So the first is how does climate change affect local weather today? And then that's going to translate into how it affects income and output today in a location. So local weather obviously can directly affect today's economy, both by affecting productivity and affecting capital stocks in today's economy. When you just account for local weather, you're doing what I call a short-run local calculation of climate impacts, as if climate were a one-off phenomenon that just affected us and nobody else. That's not what climate change is, but it's something we can calculate pretty confidently. And to be fair, this is what pretty much all economic literature to date is focused on. It's mostly focused on these contemporary local impacts and projecting those into the future. But there's more to climate change. So climate change doesn't just affect weather today, it affects weather in all periods, both in the past and the future. So we need to think about how local weather has changed in the past as well. And why does that matter for today? Well, today's capital, resource, and knowledge stocks are different, either because past local weather directly affected those stocks, it degraded them or enhanced them or whatever it did to them. The other option is that we invested in those stocks as a response to local weather, both what it did to our investment opportunities and to our beliefs about the payoffs from future investment. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why today's stocks might be different because of climate change we experienced in the past. And to capture those, we need to know what the effects of past local weather and the economy are. And when you add A and B, you get what I call a long-run local calculation of climate impacts. Climate is a persistent phenomenon, but it's still only you and not a pattern of weather changes around the country. So then we also need to think about national weather and ultimately even global weather. And national weather includes both contemporary and past components. And why does weather outside of your own location matter? It affects prices and beliefs about climate change. So national weather is going to affect what the prices are and therefore affect your output and your income. Also, you update beliefs about future climate change, which affects your investment plans based on your own history of local weather, but also weather around the country and around the globe is informative about your future weather and your location. To the extent that everybody's getting warmer, it makes us more confident in this warming trend. And so we want to account for it for that reason as well. If you combine all three of these channels, I call that the full calculation of the results that we're going to see. And this is climate change that's persistent. It's been around for a while and it's not going anywhere and it's widespread. It affects the broader economy. It affects weather in broader locations, not just in your own particular location. Our confidence in our ability to estimate it decreases as we go from A to C, but all the channels are real channels. So we need to start with A and then add additional channels on and then see how things get noisier, but also how the estimates move as we make those additions. Broadly, how do we estimate those costs given that framework? Well, first, we've got to estimate the effects of current and past local and national weather and income. Then we need climate models, big computational projects, which I'm not going to create, but I'll just consume, to determine what the weather would have been without climate change. And I'll have basically a slide or two on that. And then we combine these two to calculate how income changed because of climate change. So we know what climate did to the weather, we know what weather does to income, and then we combine these two to get the change in income. So first, how do we get the effects of weather? So there's going to be a regression building off the conceptual framework. Directly ties into it or directly follows from it. So the dependent variables log change in income per capita. We're looking at basically how the growth rate of income per capita changes with weather. And I have county level data on income per capita for the US, and I'll be using 1970 to 2019. The data doesn't really go back any further. Weather data, what I'm gonna do is instead of looking at the average temperature in a county over a year, my income data is only annual, unfortunately. I'm following a lot of literature and doing what we call binning weather data. So for every day, you calculate the average temperature in that county over the day, weighted by where people live in the county, and you then classify the day as falling into a hot, cold, warm, or cool bin, and then you count the number of days in each bin over the year. So some years have more days in a hot bin, some years have more days in a cold bin, but we're going to see how having one more day in a hot, cold, cool, warm, or I guess those are the options, in any one of those bins is then going to affect income per capita. I'm going to have what we call covariates I'll talk about. I'm going to allow for weather to affect different locations differently. I don't require the effect to be the same everywhere, and this is really critical because this is how we get spatial predictions. I'm going to have what's called county fixed effects for those who think about this stuff. I'm going to allow counties to differ permanently in unobserved ways that we don't know what they might be. Anything that's always different about one county to another is going to be absorbed by these terms, which means I'm really looking at the effects of weather that is not normal weather for a county. And I want to see then how income per capita responds to that abnormal weather. I also include what are called year fixed effects. So these take account of all the US-wide economic conditions. I'm not going to allow those to sort of infiltrate my estimates. Business cycles and things like that will be absorbed by these. Time trends, I'm going to allow states to evolve differently from each other. So they have different institutions, different market prospects. All these things change over time. So I'm going to pick up anything that's different about a state over time, I hope. I'm going to give more weight to counties that have more income per capita, partly because they should be measured better. And then standard errors, technical matter, but basically I allow for all sorts of correlation among counties that I don't need to observe. Okay, so the weather variables, what are these? So for current weather, all I have to do is count up the number of days of each type in the year, and then I get these 4 weather variables. For past weather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct these variables for each of the 5 prior years. So I'll have the number of hot days last year, the year before that, and so there'll be 5 different variables like that. I'll also show you what we call a robustness check, where I make sure that I'm not sensitive to this assumption, and I start going back to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on years. National weather, I have to make a choice. So the choice here is what is the index of national weather? I can't just have a variable for every county in the country in the regression. That's not really a meaningful thing to do. So what I do is I aggregate weather around the country, but giving more weight to counties that are closer to your county. So in the US, a county is like a subdivision of what would be a province in Canada. So like a county is more would be like the area around Toronto would be a county. So the idea is that what we're trying to get is how prices and beliefs in your county change with weather around the country. Your prices are going to be more sensitive to weather in places closer to you, and your beliefs about your own future weather are going to be more sensitive to weather you see in places close to you. I live in Arizona. The weather in Maine is less informative about my future weather than is the weather in New Mexico or California. So I'm going to basically weight each county gets its own national weather variable that's different from every other county's because it's emphasizing the counties that are close to that county. So I'm also not going to require that weather affect everybody in the same way, and this is really important. So I allow the effects of weather to vary by how hot or cold a county is on average over this 30-year period, 1950 to 79. And the idea is that hot and cold counties may have adapted differently to weather. And this is an intuitive thing. In Arizona, we're used to dealing with heat. Cold days aren't really as common. I think a day that we don't find that hot would probably cause a lot of problems in Toronto. Average income per capita over the sample, it's often thought income is a main determinant of how people, quote unquote, adapt to weather and to climate change. And so we definitely want income per capita to be a component of that. The composition of the economy should really affect its exposure. So I have measures of the shares of agriculture, manufacturing, and resource extraction in each county. And then I also have population weighted latitude and longitude. So this is going to pick up every other geographic factor that's not being absorbed by the stuff above. So for instance, being closer to a coast might matter in its own right. Being further west means you're more arid in the US, you have less humidity, and that can mean that heat has a different effect. So I'm allowing all of those sorts of factors to come into play. Okay, so what do I get from running the regression? This is just the raw effect of weather on income per capita. The blue or this is the short run local calculation. So this is just today's weather. What does it do to income per capita? Holding fixed all past weather and weather around the country. So what I want to focus on first is the top row. The dark blue is the effect of cold days. The light blue is the effect of cool days. Orange is going to be warm days, and red days is going to be hot days. And this is going to be constant across the next few graphs. The top row is the effect on the average county. So the average income per capita, average climate. There is no one county that's actually at the average, but if there were, this would be the average county. And we don't get a significant effect for warm, cool, and cold days. If anything, the point estimate suggests cool and cold days are beneficial. It suggests for the average county, but not for everybody. And it suggests that warm days are harmful, but it's not significant. But hot days in the red do cause a significant reduction in income per capita. There's about a 0.1% reduction in income per capita for every additional day above 80 degrees Fahrenheit on average. But now let's look how that changes with different aspects of a county, different qualities of a county. So the richer you are, this is probably one of the more surprising things I found. One would think the richer you are, the less exposed you are to weather, but it's actually the reverse. We found that cool and cold days are beneficial for the average county. They're even more beneficial for the richer counties. We found that hot and warm days are harmful for the average county, and they become even more harmful for the richer counties. So what this box is showing is that if you make your income per capita greater by 1 standard deviation, how does the effect on the top row change? And so the negative value for the hot days for the red bar means the red bar on the top row would move even further to the right for the richer counties. And the positive value for the blue circle means the blue circle on the top row moves even further to the left, and the blue circle moves even further to the right. So it's making the patterns on the top row even more extreme when you get richer, which is not what I expected. What does it matter for being further north? This might be a special interest to Canadians. The further north you are, the more exposed you are to heat. Even holding your climate constant, even holding your temperature constant. So just being further north means you're more exposed to heat. Agricultural share, the more agricultural counties are also more exposed to both warm and hot days. And I think some people would find that intuitive. If you go to the long run local calculations, so accounting for past weather, you get broadly similar stories. Pretty much everything goes in roughly the same direction. Not all the effects are significant in the same way, but the patterns are pretty similar to what we'd seen. If you go to the nationwide calculation, things start changing. So now we're looking at the effects of heat everywhere around the country, both current and in the past. And how does that heat both locally and everywhere around the country affect income per capita where you are? So hot days are still bad. Now warm days are at least as bad as hot days, and they're the ones that are significantly bad. Cold days are also clearly beneficial, and cool days are also, very likely to be beneficial for the average county. Now being richer is helpful for every one of the weather variables, which is what I more would have expected. Now also being agricultural, it also tends to be more helpful, especially for hot weather. So agriculture in this estimation makes you less vulnerable to hot weather when you're thinking about impacts being spread around the country. Okay, so the second part, moving toward bringing this into the effects of climate change. So that was just if you happen to get an extra hot day or extra cold day, what would happen? But we want to know whether climate change actually gives you more hot or cold days and then combine them. So what would weather have been in the absence of climate change? How do we get that? I won't go in detail through this. It's there for anyone who's interested. I'll say at a high level, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you've probably seen it in the news when they release the reports every 5, 6, 7, 8 years, IPCC. They have a big database they put together every year for the reports where all these climate models run on supercomputers, run the same experiment, and upload the results to that database. We downloaded the model data from that database. One of the experiments they run basically removes humans from the climate. And this is one of the ways they know climate change is real, is that if you run these models from 1900 on and you have humans in them, you can replicate the 20th and 21st centuries so far pretty well. If you take humans out, you don't get a trend in the climate, you get more of a flat line. So we're using the models that don't have any humans, meaning there's no greenhouse gases. There's also no air pollution, which also has an effect on the climate. And then we do some bias corrections to make sure everything lines up. Okay, so is this sensible? Like, is there climate change? So what I'm going to do first, just to validate what we're doing, I'm looking at population weighted average weather around the whole United States. So what's the average number of hot days, average number of cold days, and how have they trended over time? So hot days were actually 1960s were pretty hot. But then hot days have trended up over time, pretty much since the low point in the 70s. They very steadily marched upward, and that's the red line that's going up over time. Warm days have also gone up. The change in days per year has been going up over time, and we have more warm days now than we did back in 1990. The change in cold days has not been as dramatic, and I'll show you in a bit why that is. There really is no trend in cold days, or not much of one, maybe a slight declining trend, but not a clear one. But cool days have decreased pretty dramatically, and that's going to be important because they have different implications for economic output. What does this look like spatially? So the gold are counties that don't have a day of that type. So if you look at the top left, this is where have we seen the bigger changes in cold days around the United States. The red and light red areas are places that have gotten more cold days. The blue and dark blue areas are places that have gotten less cold days, and the gold places just don't have any cold days at all. So most of the country has less cold days, but there's an area in the middle of the country, in the Midwest, where where they've gotten more cold days over time, and this is a known phenomenon among climate scientists called the Midwestern warming hole. But taking that out, the rest of the country basically has fewer cold days than it used to. Top right, basically everywhere has fewer cool days than it used to. Bottom left, the northern half of the country has more warm days than it used to. The southern half, the hot part of the country, has less warm days than it used to. Why is that? Go to the bottom right panel, because they have a lot more hot days. So basically, in much of the country, you shifted cool days into warm and hot days. In the southeast and the southwest, what was warm days have become hot days. And so you've lost warm days on net. But all this is fairly sensible, and it validates that what we're doing is sort of reasonable. All right, let's move toward now actually getting the effects of climate change and kind of moving toward the end. So let's combine the steps and see what we get. So impacts of climate change and income per capita by county. I'll briefly summarize this. There's a lot of heterogeneity. So the changes in cold days have helped some locations, which is the blue. It's also hurt some locations, and that's the red on the top left. Change in hot days on the bottom has helped some locations, that's the blue, in the southwest, southeast, maybe the upper Midwest, and it's hurt some locations in the middle of the country, and that's the red. What we really want to know is what if we aggregate all changes at once? So what's the net effect of climate change? So what we see is in the short run local calculation, and I'll show you the rest later. So this is only if we treat climate as being one-off localized phenomenon. The middle of the country has been hurt, but the edges of the country, the southwest, the southeast, even parts of the mid-Atlantic and northeast, have been helped by climate change. But we know that's not the right calculation. So let's see what we get if we do more. So now the middle and the right add in first the effects of past weather, and then on the right also add in the effects of weather around the country. So if we look at the middle panel, the patterns are very similar when you bring in the effects of past weather, but all the magnitudes get bigger. The blues get bluer and the reds get redder, because now climate change isn't just a one-year phenomena. It's affecting a whole string of years in a very similar way and making both the benefits and the losses seem worse than they were. On the far right, what's interesting is that when you account for effects around the country, the patterns almost flip. Now, the places that look to be beneficial are now look like they're the places where climate had a strong cost and a very large cost. They're dark red, whereas the upper part of the country that was the most harmed part now looks like the part that benefited from climate change. And that is, if you're interested in Canada and you want to extrapolate there, most of the Canadian population lives just off the top edge of the map. So it may not Toronto for that part, but much of the western half of Canada is right above the blue part of this map and would benefit. Toronto's closer to the northeast where you see more of a cost. So it'd be different west and eastern Canada, I would conjecture. So it's critical to account for how climate changes weather patterns, not just local weather. You get a very different story once you do that. If we aggregate across the whole US, and this is the real main takeaway plot that I'll pretty much wrap up after doing this, the red are the short run local calculation, the orange is the long run local calculation, and the blue is the full calculation. The top row is the total effect of climate change, and then the rows below that show whether that effect is coming from cold, hot, warm days, whatever. So the total effect on the short run local is a 0.4% reduction in income per capita over 2000 2019 due to climate change. Long run local, and it's significant, by the way. Long run local, not significant, but now we're looking at about a 1% reduction in income per capita, bigger magnitude. You bring in the full nationwide calculation, which I'd argue is a theoretically correct one, even if the more empirically challenging one. You have a very noisy estimate. The confidence interval goes up to around 2% losses, but the point estimate's around 12% losses. So we're looking at much more dramatic losses when we bring in the broader country, but way noisier. It could be anywhere from 2 to 20% losses. 20% seems very implausible. I'd put money on it being closer to 2, but the point is they're amplified once you bring in effects around the country. What drives it is warm and hot days. It's the bottom two rows. So it's changes in warm and hot days are the main thing, and changes in cold days matter a bit too. Briefly, I do a whole bunch of robustness checks just to make sure this isn't about one specification. By and large, things are pretty insensitive to doing a whole bunch of stuff. The one I want to highlight, because I think it matters in applied practice, is that if you drop the warm and cool bins and only look at changes in cold and hot days, you lose almost all of the effect. So it's not, we often focus on extremes of climate change, but it's not just extreme weather that matters. All kinds of weather matter, and we have to look at shifts all along the distribution of weather to get the full effect. I can also vary that lag length going beyond 5 years. And again, for the most part, things are fairly stable until you start getting like out to 15 and 20 years, and there's econometric issues in doing that. But mostly, if I go to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lags, the broad stories are what I've been saying. The numbers might change a little, but not a lot. Okay, so in sum, what have we done? This is a new framework for estimating the impact of climate. We're looking at losses in the US at around 0.4% of national income per capita, and it could be, you could argue it's 10 times larger than that. That'd be supported by the full calculation. This is not a comprehensive accounting, so this is not sea level rise, not disasters, not precipitation. That's at least insofar as it's different than temperature, not mortality. But the reason I focused on temperature because it's an easily quantified variable with a lot of good variation, and it's something that small changes in, if temperature has an effect and there's a bunch of small changes in temperature day by day, those effects can add up. And we've seen even without these more obvious things that the effects of small changes in temperature by themselves can add up to a big number. And finally, this framework is extensible. It can be updated with New Year's data, other countries' data. You can use industry level data if you have good data. The US, the data only goes back to 2000 for that. It's just not enough years to do something good. But individuals could have better data through their companies or organizations or whatever. So thank you again to GRI for funding this. I really look forward to questions, and I appreciate you taking the time and attention to help out today and learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for providing an excellent overview of the reports and its findings. Now we'll dive a little deeper into a few prepared questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you haven't already done so, please submit your questions for Derek through the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as time allows. So kicking things off, you touched on this during your presentation. Most researchers do tend to rely on historical data to make future predictions about climate. So what are the weaknesses of this approach and projecting far outside of sample data?
Right. So I'm also relying on historical data, but I'm projecting impacts on a period that's right adjacent to the historical data. So things look like they did in history. When we start projecting impacts from 2090 to 2100, which is a typical exercise in the literature, I mean, imagine you were doing this in 1900 and you're looking at the effects of weather in the US economy over 1850 to 1900, and then using that to extrapolate how climate change in 2000 is going to matter. Economy is totally different in the year 2000. We have the internet, we have computers, we have flush toilets. There are a whole lot of things that are different. So it's just a safer exercise because things look more like they did in history now than they would in the future.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And were you surprised by what the research revealed about your geographic concentration of risk with an uneven distribution? You touched on it in your presentation, but maybe you want to elaborate a bit more about the climate change impacts across geographic regions, and what can this tell us about the resiliency or vulnerability of assets and investments in different locations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, there's a lot I found surprising about the spatial pattern. So I'm not surprised that there's a strong spatial pattern, and I'm not surprised that there's winners and losers. I have to say that the way the spatial pattern flips from the local calculations to the national calculations was not something I saw coming, and it's not something I have a great explanation for, and that's something that I would like to figure out exactly what's going on there. But I did not see that coming. In a lot of ways, the national calculations look more like what one would expect, like colder areas benefiting and hotter areas having cost. And that could just reflect at some level that in the local calculations, we see that hot areas are used to dealing with heat, but we're not seeing the effects of heat over a hot region and how that piles up in a hot area. But I don't have, the data can't say exactly what the mechanism is. It can just say that that's the correlation in the data, basically. In terms of what can it say about vulnerability or investments resilience, I touched on this in the presentation. The more surprising finding was income per capita, that your exposure to local weather, income per capita is not protecting people from local weather, but it does seem to be protecting themselves from weather patterns that are not local. And that is not something I expected and not something I've seen touched on in other work.
Yeah, so certainly something for our insurers and asset managers and even bankers for that matter on the
Yeah.
call to dive into a little bit further and keep in mind as they're putting their strategies together. Can you talk a bit about why you decided to omit certain factors such as extreme weather events and sea level rise from your research and scope? You touched on a bit, and there's a ton of research out there on extreme weather events. It seems like a very natural place to spend a lot of time studying, but you've actually taken a different approach here for a very intentional reason. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so in a given paper, you can't do everything. As you get sometimes you got to focus on doing certain things well. And so I'm looking at there's a lot of work on each of these topics, and I think people precip is harder, but most of these people recognize that they're each important and that they're an important component of cost. What is really valuable about temperature from this framework is that there's a lot of data on it day by day around the country in each location. So you have a lot of what we call variation. Like there's a lot of way you can connect temperature to output and income and look at how it changes with income per capita and with climate and all this kind of stuff really easily because there's so much variation in temperature across space within the country and over time within a given location in the country. Whereas extreme events kind of happen and they don't, and there's questions how you measure it. And sea level rise is more of a gradual process. It doesn't have the same sort of like one day is hotter, the next day is cooler type of phenomena. So empirically, temperatures it adds up with small shifts. I don't know if it's the most important channel or not, but it's a channel that really lends itself to data work in a certain kind of way.
Hmm. Yeah. And it's certainly something that I think as you do more research, you'll be able to apply that to certain industry sectors and understand where more of the vulnerabilities are. You identified agriculture as being one. I know that paper also talks about manufacturing sector and the pros of temperature differences. But there are certainly, like from a sectoral perspective, our membership base will be able to take that insight and apply it to the risk assessments for their sectors.
Correct. And they can apply the framework with their own data as well in their sectors and where their exposure might be. And I mean, they can get any person in the audience who can get weather data. And if you have data on your assets and how they performed over time, you can link the two and you can perform the same kind of projection and see how climate's affected your returns so far. I will say in terms of industry exposure, I have a paper looking at how option markets price seasonal climate. So looking at when the U.S. forecasting agency releases forecast of like El Nino and things like that, they're like 6 to 9 months out. Which firms' options show that traders are waiting for the forecast and are betting on the forecast? It's options all throughout the economy. So traders seem to think firms throughout the economy are exposed to broader climate, and that's consistent with the full calculation that we're seeing here in this paper.
Mhm. That's interesting, and it's almost like could it be a leading indicator for informing strategy and looking at those option markets to understand where the potential risks are?
This is a major interest of mine. So I'm interested both in how to design markets that can allow people to bet on what might happen so that we can back out what people throughout everybody where you are knows a little bit about your local climate and your local ability to adapt to it. And aggregating that information through a market to me is way more efficient than having me with my computer try to do it in a very core statistical way. So I would like that as a complementary method. And I do think there's a lot of information already embedded in financial markets, and how do you back that out from the prices you can see is a really important topic.
Yes, that's great. I'm going to encourage everyone to put their questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Um, uh, the next question we have for you is, how can Canadian researchers use this framework to learn more about temporal and spatial impacts of climate risk in the Canadian context?
So there is nothing US specific about this framework. It could be adapted directly to Canadian data with Canadian output data and Canadian weather data. I'm way more familiar with US data because of where I just happen to sit. But if I happen to be sitting a few hundred miles further north or a few thousand kilometers further north, maybe I would have done this with Canadian data by default. But there's no reason for me to think that Canadian data would be substantially better or worse in this front. I think you could do the exact same exercise. That said, to the extent that most of the Canadian assets are concentrated close to the US border, to first order, probably the effects are going to be continuous over the US border, and you can pretty much look at the plots and figure out what would happen to the Canadian assets right over the border.
Hmm. Great. We have one question from the audience that is as follows. Wondering if you've done any research or seen research on tipping points for extreme weather. So how a prolonged drought would impact energy generation in certain assets.
So tipping points are a longstanding interest of mine. I've done work on how tipping points should be influencing policy today. Like how should we be more cautious in the face of tipping points, especially given that we can react to them and we'll be learning about them over time. I have not in this line of work accounted for tipping points insofar as like I have not looked at where I think the question's going, like, is a dry year worse if the previous 4 years have been dry? So like in this paper, to make it concrete, I told you I'm accounting for temperature in previous years, but I'm allowing the effects of temperature of a hot year a year ago or 3 years ago to still matter, which is getting toward the tipping point concern. What I'm not doing is doing what we would call interacting these, where I'm allowing these to directly build on each other. Being hot 2 years ago in my framework is not worse because you were also hot 3 years ago. It's an independent effect. Statistically, it's a little harder, but obviously there's something real about that I'm missing by not doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The next question we have is sort of a three-part question, and how can pension and investment fund managers use the insights from this research to inform their investment decisions? And then the second part of that is how do you apply it to banks? And of course, the third, insurers.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. And so this is, sort of getting out of my depth, like how you actually apply things in practice. So one thing you can definitely do is figure out the change in your risk due to climate change by using the same framework based on where your assets are. And that could be to the extent that we're projecting further climate change in the future, that could be a valuable piece of information to have. Another one insight is also though that what the daily weather matters, and it's not, as I just showed at the end, it's not even extremes. It's like just warm and cool days matter, not just hot and cold days. And so to the extent that you have weather data is extremely accessible. So I'm doing a follow-up project through funded by the US's National Science Foundation, where one thing that we're doing is we're trying to link firms' market data to weather and forecast data around the country to figure out for each firm traded on U.S. markets, which parts of the country are they exposed to their weather? So not just where their assets, but where their supply chains, where their markets. And that framework is tied very naturally to what I just showed. And so you've got stock market data. You can see how stocks move with different weather and forecasts around the country, and that can tell you something about firms' exposure. So all of these things, follow from the same sort of conceptual framework, and there's similar exercises at heart, and they can directly guide investments and thoughts about risk premium and their evolution over time.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think you can almost form baskets or indices that you're tracking as a risk indicator for certain sectors within your portfolio. And a lot of that can then be automated and monitored on an ongoing basis to kind of understand where those risks lie within your supply chain that affects your borrowers.
It may be a
Supply
dimension of
chains of
hedging
your
that
borrowers.
doesn't correlate with ways that we tend to hedge, right? It might be that there's a whole
Mhm.
other factor out there that we should be including in our basket in order to smooth out returns. And so that would be a valuable thing to see how that risk premium sort of vary by industry for sure.
Yeah. We have a question about if you could just share the name of the paper that you mentioned about options, climate risk and impact.
Oh, I can even put I don't know, do I have access to the chat? Like, can I send everybody a thing? It's,
Yeah.
I'm blanking on the name. I'm getting the name for you right now. It's in Nature Communications. It's one thing that's nice about them is they're open access, so literally anybody can download it. I should have the name in my own paper, probably.
That's okay. And we can always
I'll
follow
get it
up
for you in a second.
to all of our attendees with the information related to that paper as well.
I
So,
have it. It's financial markets value skillful forecast of seasonal climate.
it's a long one.
Yeah.
That's great.
Financial markets value skillful forecast of seasonal climate.
There you go.
It's a tongue twister.
Yeah, exactly. So we have another question. It's a little bit similar to what we've talked about, but more specificity, because that's where our practitioners can really apply the work that what you presented here. And it's from one of our pension funds. So Canadian pension funds have significant exposure to sectors like infrastructure, including toll roads, airports, globally. So on a global basis. So which alternative asset classes are most vulnerable to climate change? And how can investors prepare to protect their funds from these risks? And how can climate-related changes, are also called climate risk factors, be incorporated into asset valuations for current accounting and valuation purposes? So there's a few questions in there. Maybe let's talk about the vulnerability of asset classes on a global basis. Is there an application of your paper that can be used in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the perfect answer to all these. That would be really valuable. I think one upshot of the paper for the question about how to value alternative assets like toll roads and airports globally is that it's pretty clear from this work that weather patterns matter. It's the same upshot from the seasonal outlooks paper that I referred to with options markets, that weather patterns matter, and they matter for everybody. Same upshot of other work I'm doing with the jet stream. The jet stream pattern matters. It matters for all sorts of industries. So over and over, everything points to it's not about weather where you are, it's about the pattern of weather around a much broader region. And we
Mhm.
start talking about things like toll roads and airports. I have to imagine that that's triply to quadruply true relative to any other industry you might look at. So there the question becomes figuring out what is the pattern of weather that we need to be paying attention to, and then figuring out how that pattern of weather would change. So it's a little bit more of a data mining exercise because you have to somehow quantify global weather into discrete patterns and figure out what are the patterns that can comprise global weather and which particular of these patterns are the ones that assets are responding to. And I haven't seen
Mhm.
anybody taking that on, but that seems to be where these lines of work are pointing.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really valuable. Certainly a lot more work to be done, but less of a shot in the dark. You're understanding a little bit more about what you're looking for and how to what to monitor.
At least it'd be clearly wrong just to look at how does this airport exposed to weather where the airport is. It's clearly
Right,
important to be counting for weather everywhere, and the question is what's the best way to do that?
right, right. We have a question from the audience. Can you talk a little more about the more negative effects on the Midwest compared to the coast, and if those effects continue to be evident in your national level calculations?
Yeah, so there's heterogeneity between the Midwest and the coast. So the everything looked dark red in the final maps because I basically had like a color-coded top bin that I was using for all the figures. So it just sort of like smoothed out variation within that. But it's still true that the Midwest and the coast are different. I don't know offhand, partly because the last maps I looked at had that top-coded bin, that I don't know offhand whether which way that went, but there's still variation. It's variation within every all these regions losing rather than variation between winners and losers in the national calculation. In the local calculations, obviously the variation is that the coast looked like winners and the Midwest looks like a loser. But in the national calculation, the lower part of the Midwest and the coast all lose. They just lose to different degrees. And then I
Mhm.
don't remember offhand which one loses more.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. So, in your research, do you also look at potential gains in income due to climate change and which industries could be benefited in asset valuation returns? We tend to be kind of like more downside focused from naturally, I think, in a risk
Mhm.
management framework, but it's so important to also look at those opportunities as well from a risk
Completely. And so
management
I didn't
perspective.
frame this as estimating as like everything in losses. I had an impact. So I allowed
Yeah.
positive and negative values, and that was very intentional. I honestly I didn't have a strong belief over whether the aggregate impact was going to be positive or negative. It would not surprise me if I had found that climate change were a small positive benefit to the US economy over the last 20 years. I doubt that'll be true over the next 200 years, but the last 20 years that'd be totally plausible. It's not what I found, but I did find a lot of variation. There were both blue and red colors in those maps, and all the blue places benefited. They were coming out ahead because of climate change. All the red places are coming out behind. And then when you sum them to get the aggregate national effect, it so happens that the red places outweigh the blue places. And on in aggregate, the US comes out behind. But yeah, I completely agree. There will be winners and there will be losers, and there will always be, it will never be true that everybody is absolutely losing, at least in the near term, by a lot. And I did not want to assume that up front, that there would be one or the other.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And we have another question around if you look at climate migration as part of your research.
Mm.
So, for example, current trends and possible future trends as a result.
I have not looked at that, and that is not in this. And I'm explicitly holding population patterns fixed when I think about the effects of climate change in the economy. It's arguably not true so far that the US population has not dramatically reallocated because of climate change. I mean, and clearly it's the hot places in the country that are still growing, and maybe they would have grown faster without it, but it's hard to probably make that case given how fast they're growing. So the I do our top student on the market this year is explicitly just studying migration. His last name is Baluja, Baluja. He's doing it in Mexico, and it's a really unique paper. I've seen nothing like it, where he's got individual level on data from migrants in Mexico going way back, and you can see what makes them migrate based on income elsewhere, weather elsewhere, how they select where they go. And then they can simulate how those migration patterns change within Mexico over time as the climate changes. And one of the upshots is that it's really important what people believe about climate change, that they
Mhm.
migrate in a very different time and to very different places when they understand climate change versus when they don't and they're just naively reacting to the weather. And so then policies to inform people about climate change and they make those decisions become really important from that perspective.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And I can see that having a lot of relevance to our real estate sector, insurance, GDP, and many other factors that our members use in their modeling.
And migration flows for Canada can be a very large fraction of the population over the century. And we think about people moving out of less pleasant places and moving to Canada. Like that could be a first order importance to Canada for sure.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, how can regulators and governments use the insight from this research to inform their policy and regulatory development? I know we have a couple of regulators on the phone here in our audience, and so how might they use the insights from this paper to either inform their regulation or to understand the analysis that might be coming from their regulated institutions better?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways depending on what kind of regulator one is. So if one is more of a financial regulator, there are a lot of questions of what it means to disclose climate risk. And so tools like this start offering a quantitative way to begin thinking about what it would mean to disclose that risk. The the side that tends to come a little more naturally to me to think about is more regulate I'd be interested if an institution like the Canadian Central Bank, like the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada. I've talked to both these groups, and I'd be really interested to see them communicating their estimates of climate losses regularly through a formal framework like this, because I think it would just be so powerful for shifting the conversation. Just to have a sense of this is what climate change did to the economy this year. This year it looks like maybe we came out ahead because of climate change. Oh, this year it looks like we came out behind and just having to watch that and think about that and the way we think about inflation and employment numbers and things like that, it requires that we can do something somewhat credible, which is the goal in this project is to start providing a credible foundation for what we were doing. But just having a number like that in the discourse would be such a powerful thing for coordinating investment and expectations and public decision making and all kinds of stuff. It would be incredibly important to me.
Mhm. And so there's applications then within regulators to build up their capacity to do this type of analytics and using the framework within your paper and others and use that to inform policy.
And by and large, it can be done better by a regulator if you have access to data we can't get access to. Like, for instance, you can get treasury
Mhm.
data and actually do a much finer analysis than doing it just at like counting aggregate income. And you can go much further back and use longer time periods with income tax data. So there's a lot of ways that can be done better by a regulator in-house than it can by an academic out of house.
Mhm. Mhm. So tell us, what aspects of your research are you most and least comfortable with regarding the framework you've developed? Where is that? Where are the refinement opportunities, and where are the things that you really want to hone in on as opportunities to leverage?
Yeah, the most comfortable with the conceptual framework I think is really helpful. I think it's in clears something up that the academics have been a bit confused about. It provides a clear guide for for what the right statistical model is to write down and run. And within that model, I'm fairly confident and feel good about the local estimations, both long run and short run. Like those I think are pretty solid, they're pretty robust, they make sense, they go the same direction, they cohere with each other. The national weather is harder because there you have to make an assumption, going back to the same conversation we had earlier about toll roads and airports, like how are we going to collapse a weather pattern into a single index? And I did it a
Mhm.
certain way using this inverse distance weighted weather, so weighting weather closer to you more heavily than weather further from you. there are many other ways, many other indices one could do, and really once you do a full exploration, like have machine learning almost figure out what the relevant indices would be. And so that there is no part of me that thinks that I got the exact perfect index just by constructing something intuitive. At the same time, you know, whether close to you is going to matter. I think I'm capturing something real, but it is
Yeah.
only, it doesn't include global weather as I've currently done it, and it is one particular index even within national weather, and it's almost surely not the single best or right thing one could do. I mean, in reality, there should be multiple of these, not just one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably a couple of years from now, we'll have a similar webinar with more research that involves AI and machine learning.
Oh yeah,
And
invite me to that.
well, you're consider yourself booked.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Um, one of my colleagues actually has asked a question about whether you've studied climateflation, and it's funny because I was thinking the exact same thing as I was reviewing more of your work, and it seems like that is an area that you would have dabbled in, and it's something that we're particularly focused on and plan to be doing more work in that area.
So honestly, this is the first time I've ever heard that term. So
Oh,
I assume it means climate inflation. Is it referring
correct.
to
Yeah,
spending, the inflation induced by spending to adapt to climate change, inflation due to spending on emission reductions, or it's
the
inflation due to
whole kit and
disasters?
caboodle. Yeah, yeah, just yeah, inflation driven climate cost driven by inflation and vice versa. It's sort of
I
a
see.
double materiality impact, I
I
think.
see. I mean, so does what I just showed count, or are we talking more about nominal inflation?
Yes.
I
It does count. It's I think it would be quantifying the impact is solely due to inflation. Sort of, it might even almost be a subset of what you've come up with to
I
isolate.
see.
Yeah.
I've not looked at inflation per se to see how price rises are changing with temperature, with or with any sort of climate spending or proactive climate action. I have obviously thought about the impacts of climate change and the extent that impacts are then going to affect the real economy and affect how much money it can bear and then affect inflation. That's all going to tie in. But I've never directly tracked it all the way back to inflation as an outcome. So I don't know if the answer is yes or no, but I'll let you figure it out. I appreciate the question.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take that one back, and probably more conversations to be had on that as well. Um,
I think there
what
are,
would
yeah.
be what would be the next steps for you to continue exploring this research area? We've kind of talked about a number of different opportunities, but if you were to prioritize and say this is the next step that we need to take to progress the work in this field on this framework, what would it be?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a step that I think could be done that I don't have near-term plans to do, and I'll talk about a step that I do have plans to do. And they're both things I've touched on already. So the one that follows naturally within this paper as being the obvious thing to do to make it better would be this more machine learning approach to what is the best national weather index. I as I said before, I clearly there's a limit statistically to how many you can have. So you want to make sure you have the best one or two, and almost surely the one I happen to construct is not going to be the single best one. So that would just make the framework better. It'd probably change some results. It would just be an improvement on the paper. That said, my time's spoken for and constrained. I don't really have the time at the moment to do it. I think what I did is at least a first order reasonable way to approach it. The what is related that I am doing, as I mentioned, I have this National Science Foundation funding, and there what we are doing is try to figure out the distribution of economic activity as exposed to weather by industry, using financial market data. So we're going to be able to say this industry is exposed to weather in these parts of the U.S. not just based on what they own and where it is, which by the way we usually have very bad data about in at least like the non-private world, but also based on what they're exposed to upstream and downstream through their markets. And that's something I've been interested in for a while, and that will open up follow-on questions and kind of tie back into what I showed today as well.
Mhm. And I think it probably leads to opportunities to identify where does data collection need to happen at the source. There's so much focus on reporting and disclosure, especially for our membership group, for our members. And as their reporting systems are evolving and they're collecting more data from their clients, the research that you're producing will help identify what kind of information should be collected, perhaps more immediately and longer term to help better assess the risk of their clients and then at an industry level.
That's a great point. Because like, why did I do this at the aggregate level instead of by industry? Because obviously you'd want to know the industry answer, and I played around doing it by industry. But in the U.S., the data on output per capita by industry goes back to the year 2000, and It's
Hmm.
just not enough years to do anything with. And there's no inherent reason for that. Like that data could be collected and could be constructed, or could have been, at least at the time. And so, yeah, it really is a data constraint. And so, knowing these are the questions we'd like to answer, we can start accumulating the data that we would need to do that.
That's great. So I'm glad we had a number of participants on the call today who've heard that message loud and clear, and that really is an opportunity to inform research and also inform their strategic and risk management processes, and that they have the ability to do that. So um, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I want to thank Derek for his time and his insights today. I want to thank all of you for your participation.